Why do we fear death? They say that life is the most precious gift we have, yet we often spend our time running from the one thing we cannot escape: death. In Buddhism, we are reminded that life and death are two sides of the same coin, inseparable, yet we still fear that inevitable moment when it will come for us. But what is it that we truly fear? Is it the end of our existence? Or is there something deeper hidden beneath our anxiety? Imagine, if you will, a calm, quiet moment as you sit by a river. The water flows steadily, never stopping, always moving forward, yet it's the same river. So too is our existence, flowing and changing constantly. The question is not whether death is an end, because life itself is in constant flux, but how we choose to face it. The Buddha once said, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." So, what happens when we face the idea of death with thoughts rooted in fear and attachment? What happens when we allow ourselves to be consumed by the uncertainty of the unknown? Before we dive deeper into this question, I want you to take a moment and reflect on this. Why are you afraid of death? I encourage you to comment below with your thoughts on this. Is it the fear of the unknown? The fear of losing what you love? Or perhaps the idea of non-existence itself? Feel free to share any keywords or concepts related to Buddhism or fear that come to your mind. This is a safe space for reflection, where we can journey together through these deep, philosophical questions. Now, let's explore the essence of that fear. Why is it that, despite the fact that death is as natural as the rising and setting of the sun, we find ourselves so paralyzed by it? The fear of death. What are we truly afraid of? The fear of death is something that, in many ways, transcends time and culture. It's a universal fear, shared by every human being across the world. But what exactly are we afraid of? At the heart of this fear lies the concept of loss. Loss of self. Imagine holding something in your hands that you truly love, a cherished memory, a relationship, or even a simple object that holds sentimental value. Now, imagine it slipping from your fingers, vanishing into thin air. The pain you feel is not simply from losing that thing, but from the realization that something you thought was a permanent part of you is gone forever. This is the same feeling we experience when we think about our own death. We fear that our self, our identity, will cease to exist, like a candle flame snuffed out by the wind. This fear of losing our identity, our memories, and the people we love is deeply ingrained in us. It's a fear that has plagued humanity for centuries. Yet, if we take a step back, we must ask ourselves, is our fear of death truly justified? If death is simply the end of the physical body, why does it feel so much like the loss of everything that we are? The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus once said, "Death is nothing to us. When we are here, death is not. When death is here, we are not." Sounds logical, doesn't it? After all, if we are not there to experience death, why should we fear it? But logic alone cannot quell the fear of death. There's something more, something deeper within us that refuses to accept the finality of it all. In Buddhism, we are taught to look beyond the surface level of our fears. The Buddha challenges us to examine the very nature of what we are. What this self that we cling to so tightly really is. What if, instead of fearing the loss of our identity, we questioned whether this self ever truly existed in the way we think it does? Think about it. Our sense of self is built on our thoughts, our memories, our experiences, and our perceptions. But how permanent are these things? Really? Just like a wave in the ocean. We rise, we travel forward, and we eventually dissolve back into the vast sea of existence. But does the wave truly cease to exist when it disappears? No, it simply changes form, just like everything else in life. The illusion of the self. The Buddha taught that the idea of a fixed, permanent self is an illusion. This concept, which we hold so dearly, is the root of our fear. We identify ourselves with our bodies, our thoughts, and our achievements, and when these things change or are taken from us, we feel as though we have lost ourselves entirely. But what if this self that we fear losing was never really there to begin with? What if the I we so desperately try to preserve is just an ever-changing flow of thoughts, experiences, and perceptions? If we look closely, we see that we are constantly changing, just like the wave in the ocean. The wave is not separate from the ocean, it is the ocean itself, taking a temporary form. In Buddhist philosophy, this understanding is key to overcoming the fear of death. When we let go of the illusion of a permanent self, we free ourselves from the suffering that comes with clinging to something that was never meant to last. But how do we let go of this attachment to the self? The answer lies in mindfulness, in being present with the constant flow of change in our lives. By observing our thoughts, emotions, and experiences without attachment, we begin to see that everything is impermanent. Our bodies, our relationships, and even our very thoughts are in a constant state of flux. And just like the river that flows without ever being the same twice, we too are part of this ever-changing process. Death is not the end, the continuity of life. Now, let's take a deeper dive. In our last section, we explored the fear that arises from losing our self, that sense of identity that we cling to so tightly. But if we pause for a moment and truly examine the nature of life and death, we might realize that our perception of death is all wrong. We see death as the end, the final curtain falling, the last breath. But what if I told you that death is not the end of all things? What if death is merely a part of an eternal cycle, one that has been unfolding long before we arrived, and will continue long after we're gone? Imagine for a moment the flame of a candle. It burns brightly, providing light and warmth. But when the flame flickers and eventually goes out, what has truly ended? The light may be gone, but the warmth still lingers in the air. The smoke rises into the sky, and the very essence of that flame disperses into the atmosphere. In this sense, the flame hasn't truly disappeared, it has simply transformed. In Buddhism, we are taught that life and death are not opposites. They are not two separate events. They are part of the same unfolding process, much like the breath that enters and exits our body in an endless rhythm. This is where the Buddha's teachings take us, beyond the notion of a fixed, absolute death. Death, in its truest sense, is not the destruction of being, it is a continuation of the flow of life. Think about the seasons. Each year, the leaves on the trees change color, and eventually, they fall to the ground. But do the trees truly die when their leaves fall? No, they simply undergo a transformation, preparing for the new life that will come in spring. Death is not the end, it's simply the change in form, the transformation into something else. But where does this transformation take us? Is it simply into nothingness? Or is there something greater that we cannot yet perceive? The Buddha invites us to step away from the fear of the unknown and instead turn our attention to the present moment. The fear of death, my friends, comes from the belief that we are separate from everything else, that our existence is independent and isolated. But what if we are all interconnected, part of a larger web of life, death, and rebirth? When we let go of the illusion of separateness, we begin to understand that death is not the end. It is a part of the natural flow, an inevitable part of the ever-changing river of existence. Understanding impermanence, a way to peace. Now, let's pause for a moment and reflect on the concept of impermanence. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence, or anicca, invite us to see that nothing in life is fixed. Just as the river never stays the same, so too do we never remain static. Our bodies, our minds, and even our emotions are in a constant state of flux. In fact, if we take a closer look at our own bodies, we can see that death is happening all around us, all the time. Our cells die and regenerate, our skin sheds and renews, and even our thoughts arise and fade away like passing clouds. The very idea of you and me is built on a constantly changing foundation. The self we cling to is nothing more than a series of fleeting moments, a collection of ever-changing experiences. It's this constant change, this impermanence, that creates the illusion of death as an absolute end. We mistake the ebb and flow of life for a final destination. But in reality, death is just another part of the process. This realization can bring us peace, because it frees us from the fear that comes with trying to hold on to something that was never meant to last. But you might be asking yourself, if everything changes, if everything is impermanent, does that mean there's no meaning in life? If we're all just a collection of fleeting moments, what's the point of it all? This is the very question that the Buddha addresses in his teachings. He doesn't say that life is meaningless. Rather, he shows us that the meaning we seek isn't found in trying to hold on to things that are fleeting, but in embracing the flow of life itself, accepting the impermanence of everything around us and finding peace in that acceptance. The power of letting go. In Buddhism, we learn that the root of suffering lies in our attachment to things that we cannot hold forever. This includes our relationships, our accomplishments, and yes, even our very lives. But when we realize that these things are impermanent, we are invited to let go of our attachment to them. When we stop clinging, we stop suffering. It's as simple and as difficult as that. The Buddha teaches that when we let go of our attachment to the self, to our desires, and to our fears, we can experience a deep sense of peace. This doesn't mean that we stop caring about the world around us. It doesn't mean that we become indifferent to the people we love or the goals we pursue. What it means is that we stop trying to control everything. We accept that life will unfold as it will, and we find joy in the process, rather than in the outcome. This is how we can embrace death, not as an enemy, but as a natural part of life's cycle, a cycle that continues to flow endlessly, like the waves of the ocean. Suffering and attachment to the self, the root of our pain. Now that we've explored the continuity of life and death, and the idea that death is not an absolute end but rather a transformation, let's take a closer look at the suffering we experience when faced with death. Why is it that even though we know death is inevitable, we still experience so much pain when it comes? The answer, as the Buddha teaches us, lies in our attachment to our bodies, our identities, and the things we hold dear. Imagine holding a handful of sand. At first, you hold it gently, with an open palm, but then, fearing that the sand might slip away, you close your hand tighter and tighter. But the more you try to grasp the sand, the faster it slips through your fingers. This, my friends, is what attachment is. It accelerates the very thing we fear. When we cling too tightly to something, we often lose it faster. Our attachments to the things of this world, our possessions, our relationships, and even our identities, create the very suffering we seek to avoid. We fear losing these things because we believe they define us. We believe that without them, we are nothing. But in truth, these attachments are illusions. They are fleeting, impermanent, just like everything else in life. And it is this attachment that causes us pain when they are taken from us. The Buddha taught us that the root of all suffering is attachment, our desire to hold on to things that cannot be held. He said, to be attached is to suffer. When we are attached to the belief that we are a permanent, unchanging self, we create suffering, because life is anything but permanent. It is always changing, always in flux. But here's the paradox. The more we try to hold on to life, to our self, the more we suffer. When we accept that everything is impermanent, including our very sense of self, we can begin to release our attachments and, in turn, experience freedom from suffering. The Buddha's solution: letting go of the illusion of self. But how do we let go of these attachments? How do we free ourselves from the suffering caused by our clinging to the self? The Buddha's answer lies in the practice of mindfulness and meditation. These practices allow us to observe our thoughts, emotions, and attachments without becoming entangled in them. When we sit in meditation, we learn to observe the rise and fall of our thoughts, without identifying with them or becoming attached to them. In mindfulness, we focus on the present moment, accepting it as it is. We do not cling to the past, nor do we try to control the future. We simply allow ourselves to be fully present, fully aware of the impermanence of each moment. When we begin to understand that everything we are, our body, our mind, and even our sense of self, is impermanent, we begin to loosen our grip on it. We no longer fear change, because we understand that change is a natural part of life. This doesn't mean we stop caring about our lives or the people we love. It doesn't mean we stop striving for our goals. It simply means that we stop attaching ourselves to the idea that these things define us. We let go of the need to control and possess, and we open ourselves up to the flow of life as it is. The importance of acceptance, embracing the flow of life. In Buddhism, the key to overcoming suffering is acceptance. We must accept the impermanence of life, and we must accept death as a natural part of that process. But acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It doesn't mean we stop living or stop caring. It means we stop fighting against the natural flow of life. When we accept that everything in life is temporary, we begin to appreciate the beauty of the present moment. We no longer take things for granted, because we understand that they won't last forever. Think about the people you love. Instead of fearing that they will one day be gone, appreciate the time you have with them right now. Cherish every moment. When you do this, you'll find that your relationships become deeper and more meaningful. You'll be able to love more fully, without fear of loss. The same is true for everything in life. When we stop clinging to the idea that things should last forever, we can enjoy them fully in the present. We can be present with our work, our hobbies, and our passions, without the need for them to define who we are. Acceptance of impermanence brings peace. It allows us to live fully, without the fear of death or the anxiety of loss. When we let go of our attachment to the self, we realize that we are not separate from the flow of life. We are part of it, just as the river is part of the ocean, the wave part of the water. Embracing death, the path to living fully. So far, we've talked about how we tend to fear death, how that fear is tied to our attachments, and how the idea of losing our self can be the root cause of much of our suffering. But now, let's shift gears a bit. What if I told you that embracing death, not resisting it, could actually help us live more fully? You see, in many ways, the Buddha's teachings are about liberation, not from death itself, but from the fear and ignorance that surround it. Most of us try to avoid thinking about death, to push it to the back of our minds as we go through the motions of daily life. But what if the key to living a fuller life isn't avoiding death, but accepting it as an integral part of our journey? I want you to think about this for a moment. How would your life change if you didn't fear death? How would your priorities shift? Would you still hold on to anger, regret, or unfulfilled desires? Or would you embrace each moment with a sense of purpose, love, and gratitude? This idea is radical for many people, but for those who understand the Buddha's wisdom, it becomes clear that the fear of death limits us. It holds us back from truly living, from being fully present in our lives and relationships. When we accept death, not as something that takes life away, but as something that teaches us to appreciate life more deeply, we begin to live more fully. The Buddha's insight, living in the present. Let's pause here for a moment and reflect. One of the core teachings of the Buddha is the importance of living in the present moment. In fact, the Buddha often emphasized that our suffering arises from not being present, from being caught up in worries about the future or regrets from the past. Think about the last time you were fully present, when you weren't thinking about what would happen next or how things might turn out. It's rare, isn't it? But in those moments of presence, you probably felt more alive, more connected, and more at peace. This is because when we are truly present, we aren't weighed down by the fear of what may come. We simply experience life as it is. Now, let's bring this back to the subject of death. When we live in fear of death, we are not truly living. We are merely going through the motions, distracted and disconnected from the here and now. But when we embrace the fact that death is inevitable, that it is a part of the natural flow of life, we can begin to live in a way that is fully aligned with the present moment. This is not about being morbid or fixating on death. It's about understanding that death gives life its meaning. If life were eternal, we might take it for granted. But because death is a certainty, it makes each moment precious, meaningful, and worth cherishing. By acknowledging death, we begin to understand the value of living with intention, with clarity, and with love. A new perspective. Seeing death as a teacher. Imagine for a moment that you're facing an immense challenge in your life. Maybe you're going through a difficult time, loss, disappointment, fear of the future. In that moment, you may feel overwhelmed, unsure of how to move forward. But now, imagine approaching that challenge with the understanding that you have limited time. What would you do differently? This is what the Buddha teaches us. Death is not an enemy. It is a teacher. It shows us how fragile life is, how precious each moment really is. When we understand that death is an inevitable part of life, we start to let go of petty worries, grudges, and trivial concerns. We begin to live more intentionally, with greater purpose, because we know that time is finite. Death, when embraced, helps us live with more depth. It strips away the illusions of permanence and forces us to confront what truly matters. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence are a call to live fully now. Not to wait for some ideal future or hold on to past mistakes. Finding peace in acceptance. In the Buddha's teachings, acceptance is a central theme. Not acceptance in the sense of resignation or passivity, but acceptance as an active engagement with life. We accept that we are not in control of everything. We accept that death will come. And through this acceptance, we are freed from the constant struggle to avoid what is inevitable. Now, let me ask you, how much energy do you spend avoiding the thought of death? How often do you waste time being afraid of something that, in the grand scheme of things, is completely natural? The Buddha invites us to let go of that fear. He encourages us to stop running from death and start running toward life, toward living with full awareness, full engagement, and full appreciation. It's not about denying the reality of death or pretending that it doesn't matter. It's about living with the knowledge that death is part of the cycle of existence. And that by embracing it, we learn to cherish each moment even more. The final invitation. Live with intention. As we approach the end of this exploration, I want to leave you with a final invitation. The Buddha teaches us that the true path to peace and freedom lies not in avoiding death, but in living fully with the understanding of its inevitability. When we realize that life is precious precisely because it is finite, we stop wasting time. We stop waiting for the right moment to do what we love, to tell those we care about how we feel, to pursue our dreams. We start living with intention, fully present, fully engaged in the here and now. So, my friends, I invite you to ask yourself, what is it that you truly want to do with your life? What can you let go of to make space for what truly matters? Embrace the impermanence of life, and use that awareness to live a life of love, compassion, and clarity. Death is not the end. It is simply another chapter in the story of existence. And as we move through life, we must remember that each moment is a gift, a precious, fleeting moment that will never come again. Let us not wait until death is staring us in the face to realize the beauty of life. Instead, let us embrace the present, live fully, and, in doing so, find peace with the inevitable reality of death. Final answer. Why we shouldn't fear death. As we've journeyed through the teachings of the Buddha on life and death, there's one final question we must ask ourselves. Why do we fear death so much, when we know it's a natural part of life? If death is merely another stage in the flow of existence, why does it hold so much power over our minds, our hearts, and our actions? To understand this, let's first consider something the Buddha said. The one who is awake knows that all things must end. And yet, through the wisdom of awareness, they are not attached to any particular thing. This quote encapsulates the essence of why we fear death. It's not death itself that we fear, but our attachment to the things we believe define us. We fear the loss of what we think is permanent, the self that we cling to so desperately. But here's the beauty of the Buddha's teachings. When we truly understand the nature of life, the fear of death begins to dissolve. Why? Because we no longer see death as an end. We see it as a transition, a continuation of the natural flow of existence. The fear of death arises from our ignorance of this fundamental truth, the truth of impermanence. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches us that all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This wisdom, my friends, is not found by avoiding the topic of death, but by contemplating it deeply, by understanding that everything, including ourselves, is subject to change. When we look closely at the impermanence of life, we see that death is not an anomaly or an interruption. It is simply another step in the ongoing process of becoming. The flower blooms, withers, and falls, but it does not vanish. It becomes part of the earth, nourishing new life. In the same way, we do not end when we die. We simply transform, becoming part of the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The Buddha's wisdom on life and death. But let's not romanticize this idea of death. The Buddha was not teaching us to become indifferent to life or death. He was teaching us to embrace the truth of impermanence, to understand that life, in its essence, is fragile and fleeting. This is not to make us anxious, but to awaken us to the preciousness of each moment. Think of the story of Subal. A young man who came to the Buddha with a burning question. Why do some people die young while others live long? Why do some live in suffering while others in happiness? This question is one we've all asked ourselves at some point. Life seems unfair. It seems that some are dealt better cards than others. And death seems to come too soon for some, while others live on and on. The Buddha's answer was simple yet profound. Life and death do not follow human desires. Just as a farmer cannot control the wind or the rain, we cannot control when death comes. What we can control is how we live. This answer speaks volumes. The Buddha teaches us that death is not unjust, it is simply a part of the natural order of things. We are not in control of when or how we die, but we are in control of how we live, and it is in living with mindfulness, with intention, that we transcend the fear of death. How should we live knowing that we will die? This brings us to the final point. How should we live? Knowing that we will die? How can we live a life of meaning when the certainty of death looms over us? The answer, as the Buddha teaches, is simple. Embrace the present moment. Life is short, fleeting, and fragile, and the only time we truly have is now. So, live with purpose, live with gratitude, live with love, instead of waiting for some perfect future. Start now. Cherish the moments you have with the people you love. Pursue your passions. Be kind, compassionate, and fully present in everything you do. When we stop fearing death, we begin to see life for what it truly is, a precious, fleeting gift. Each moment is an opportunity to live fully, to experience life as it is, without the weight of regret or fear. We no longer wait for the right time to act, to love, or to be happy. We start living now, because we know that life is impermanent, and that is what makes it so valuable. The end of fear. Living with peace and purpose. As we come to the close of our exploration today, I want to leave you with one final thought. Death is not something to fear. It is something to understand. When we truly understand death, not as an enemy, but as a part of the natural order, we free ourselves from the suffering that comes with trying to avoid it. By understanding death, we understand life more fully. We see the impermanence of all things, and we begin to live more intentionally, with greater love and wisdom. We no longer live in fear of what may come, but in the peace of knowing that life is not meant to last forever, and that is exactly why it is so precious. So, my friends, as you go about your day, remember this. Life is not about avoiding death, but about embracing the present moment with a full heart. Love deeply, live fully, and, when the time comes, accept death not with fear, but with peace, for death is not the end, but simply the next chapter in the ongoing story of life. As we come to the end of this journey, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've explored together. We began by acknowledging the universal fear of death, a fear that comes from our attachment to the self and the things we hold dear. We examined how this fear causes suffering, how it keeps us trapped in the illusion of permanence, and how the Buddha's teachings invite us to see through this illusion. We also explored the idea that death is not an end, but a transformation, a continuation of the natural flow of life. Death is not something to be feared but something to be understood. It is a part of the cycle of existence, just like birth, growth, and decay. And once we begin to see death not as the end of our lives, but as a natural process of change, the fear that once controlled us begins to lose its power. Through mindfulness, meditation, and the practice of letting go of attachment, we learn to live fully in the present moment. We learn to cherish each breath, each step, each conversation, knowing that everything is impermanent. This awareness of impermanence doesn't bring us despair, it brings us peace. It frees us from the burden of fear and allows us to embrace life with clarity and love. But above all, the Buddha's teachings show us that the key to overcoming the fear of death is not to try to escape it, but to live with the knowledge that life is fleeting, to live with purpose, to love without attachment, to forgive without hesitation, to let go of the need for control and simply be present. Here and now. Now, as we conclude this reflection, I want to leave you with one final question to ponder. How will you live? Knowing that death is a part of life? How will you use the wisdom of impermanence to shape the way you approach each day? Each moment, each relationship? Will you continue to hold on to fear, regret, and attachment? Or will you let go and embrace the present with an open heart? The choice is yours. Remember, death is not something to be feared. It is a natural part of life. And when we accept this truth, we are freed from the anxiety that comes with the unknown. We can live more fully, more intentionally, and with more love. In the end, it's not the years in our life that matter, but the life in our years. So, let us live each moment with awareness, with compassion, and with a deep appreciation for the preciousness of life. When we do this, we find that death is no longer something to fear, but something to accept with peace, knowing that it is simply the next step in the eternal flow of existence.